we're stoked. This is our very first episode of Suck, Squeeze, Bang, Blow, which is the show all about engines. And the first thing we're going to do is a quick dyno test to look at a theory that I've written about quite a bit in the past, and that is the comparison of the single plane intake manifold versus the dual plane intake manifold. More specifically, the Victor Jr. Edelbrock small block Chevy intake versus the Performer RPM air gap. Now, in the old days, I used to use these single plane Victors all the time. Pretty much it was just the standard. I remember writing about those and Vic Edelbrock actually calling me on the phone and saying, will you stop telling people to put those on street cars? You're just making problems for us because everybody's junk is bogging off the line. It doesn't work quite right. But then a few years later, they came out with this dual plane air gap design, and I've really been a fan of these things. I think this is the manifold to use for any street engine under 6,500 RPM, which is a pretty broad statement, but that's what we're gonna test today to see, is the Victor Jr. better or is the air gap better? And then the thing that I want to do after that is a test I haven't done in ages, which is the RPM air gap versus the regular Edelbrock Performer RPM. Our victim for this test is just a super basic small block Chevy. It's 360 cubic inches, which is a 60 over small block. It's got a stock crank, it's got stock block, probe 6-inch rods, probe forged pistons with a little tiny 3cc dome in them, so it's 11.25/1 compression. The camshaft is a Comp Cams 294S, which is 248 at 50, 5.25 lift on 110 degree lobe separation angle. And we're running the old Dart 215 aluminum heads. These are not the new platinum heads, they're just the slightly older series. We do have 1.5-to-1 roller rockers, 1 5/8" hooker headers, and a plain old base model 750 double pumper Holly. First one on the pump, Victor Jr. All right, we got that little 350 running, and the first thing we did is get it just being consistent. Steve Brule tuned it up for us. We got a bunch of repeatable dyno runs. We took 3 of them in a row and averaged them together just to remove anomalies. And ultimately we ended up with 467 horsepower at 6,300 RPM, and it made 431 pound-feet of torque at 5,000. Now we're gonna run out and put the Performer RPM on the thing.
He meant to say air gap.
I'm hoping that we're gonna see a little bit less peak power, but more mid-range. What we're looking at here is average power curves, taking 2 poles with each intake manifold and plotting them out. And what you'll see here is this curve right here is the horsepower and torque for the Victor Jr. single plane intake manifold, and this one here is for the Performer RPM air gap dual plane intake manifold. Look at all that more meat you're getting in the power curve with the dual plane. For this particular engine, there's no way you'd choose the Victor. The RPM air gap is winning, but what we're going to go find out is if we can take the regular Performer RPM and make it run as good as the air gap. Let's look here at the 2 regular Performer RPMs, which are taller versions of the Edelbrock Performer intake. They have more plenum volume. They should be more high performance and work in a higher RPM range than the standard Performer intake. The Q-Jet version has a little bit more area right here and a slightly larger plenum volume than over here on the regular square bore style Performer RPM. Now this particular intake manifold right here has been port matched a little bit, so it's going to invalidate our test. We're not going to run it. What we are going to do is run the Performer RPM Q-Jet with an adapter plate to use a regular Holley 4150 style carburetor. RPM Q-Jet in play. What's going on is as soon as we changed to the regular Performer RPM, the carburetor was having difficulty metering right at 2,500 RPM at wide open throttle right when we start the dyno test. and we can't exactly figure out why. It's not really intuitive why that would happen because it didn't do it with the RPM air gap. So we're a bit conflicted about whether our problem with it not metering at 2500 at wide open is because it has so much airspeed that it's pulling a lot of fuel and it's just going fat and misfiring, or if it's because the airspeed is so slow that the fuel is just dripping and not atomizing. With this open spacer on here, in theory, if the airspeed is too slow, this will make it worse, right?
Yep.
So let's see. Okay, pretty much that was way better, and it just laid down a number almost exactly what we saw with the RPM air gap. See, right here what we were seeing is super fatness that was just killing the curve, but with the 1-inch open spacer, it took care of it and gave us a little bit more top end. All right, the plot thickens. Us being the clever little gearheads that we are, had a look at the RPM air gap intake manifold and noticed that they have split the divider wall in the plenum here at Edelbrock. That's a factory piece. So we're gonna go chuck this sucker into the lathe and we're gonna knock the plenum wall out of this one to see if it solves the bottom end power and makes as much top end without having to use the 1-inch spacer. Yep.
Look at that.
Right here we fixed the problem that we had at the bottom end. This is the stock intake and this is the one with the plenum divider milled out a little bit, and we matched the power up top. But if you now lay over the air gap on top of it, you can see that this is nearly as good. The air gap is that much better right there.
You're trying to build the ultimate, looks like a stalker combo where nobody's going to know you've modified anything. The original Performer RPM with our milled down plenum divider is the way to go.
Yep, and put the factory fill tube in the front, painted orange, put 283 valve covers on it, and we'll be heroes.
Do you want to put a 1-inch spacer on this thing and just see what it'll do?
Okay, 1-inch open spacer going in on our final pull to see if we can make just a little more power. That was a good torque number.
Air gap average versus us with the spacer.
But the thing you gotta say, and the test we're not gonna get to, is that the air gap with a 1-inch spacer will outrun this. I know it. I've done it too many times. And so is Steve.
Right.
Steve, tell me I'm right.
You're right, Dave.
I'm right. Steve says I'm right.
I know you're right. and it's not that that running it this way with the Performer RPM is, just better. It's just that if you're trying to pull that
stealth thing.
look off, you can.
Okay, this was pretty good. The first thing that we learned today is this little 350 Chevy, even with 11-to-1 compression and a 248 at 50 solid cam, it really liked the Performer RPM air gap dual plane intake better than the Victor Jr. single plane.
The other thing we found out is that when you put a standard Performer RPM on this thing, with the solid plenum divider in that, it will not pull down to 2500 with this big giant cam.
But what we really wanted to do is take this Performer RPM and modify it to look stock. So we had to make it make more power. We looked at the air gap and we saw that the plenum wall was cut out on it, so we modified this one, totally cleaned up our bottom end problem with it, but didn't quite have the top end power we were looking for.
So then we added a 1-inch Wilson aluminum spacer, which brought our power almost to the same level as that air gap intake.
I wish we'd gotten to the very last thing, which would have been to put the 1-inch spacer on top of the air gap, which would have made the most power overall. But we found the results we were looking for with our more stock looking intake manifold.